John Beebe, and I lead the Democratic Exchange here in the Faculty of Arts at Ryerson University. I'd like to thank the Faculty of Arts and Dean Sugerman for helping to make this event possible. As we begin today, I'd like to share a land acknowledgement. The land that I have the privilege to call home is sacred land. I am a new settler on this land and appreciate that it is the site of human activity for more than 15,000 years. It's the territory of the Haudenosaunee nations, such as the Huron-Wendat, the Petun, and the Seneca, as well as the Anishinaabe, and most recently visited by the Mississaugas of New Credit. The territory later became the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Anishinaabe to peacefully share and care for the resources and relationships around the Great Lakes. And in this moment, as we all come together to address our current health crisis, I am powerfully reminded of the wisdom of this covenant. If we are going to prevent more suffering and death, we all must care for each other, families, neighbors, as well as strangers and people we'll never meet. That's what it'll take to get us through this difficult period that I think we're all feeling. Our mission at the Democratic Engagement Exchange is simple: to build a vibrant and truly inclusive democracy for everyone who is sharing this land. Today, we're going to consider what this means for people who are new to Canada. What is the journey to active citizenship for immigrants and refugees, and ways to support that journey? But before we jump into the conversation, I'd love to get a bit of a sense of who is with us. We're going to put a couple of poll questions. So if you can also tell us where you were born using the chat, that would be helpful. So our first poll question is up, seeing who was born here and who was born outside of Canada. And as anticipated, it looks like most folks have had a chance to jump in with the response. I'll put the share the results here. So look at this, we have a perfect representation of at least the GTA, where 50% of the GTA was born outside of Canada and 50% of the GTA was born in Canada. All right, so next question. We have one more question here. For those born outside of Canada, where is it easier to vote? Was it easier to vote in Canada, or is it easier to vote in the country where you were born? And if you were born in Canada and you've had a chance to vote someplace else, some of you may have had an opportunity to vote in other countries or other jurisdictions. If you can jump, you can also jump in there. All right. Okay, I'm gonna end the poll here. I'm gonna share the results, Yeah, okay, so for most folks, it's easier to vote in Canada, although not everyone. If folks want to share in the chat a little bit about their experience voting outside of Canada or in Canada, that would be great. I think there'll be a lot of interest to see how people have experienced it. So myself personally, I was born in the United States and lived there for most of my adult life, and certainly voted there for the first time. And it was way more complicated to vote in the United States. But you know, not all just the horror stories you've heard. Actually, in where I voted in Maine, we didn't actually even have to show ID. We had to be registered, so that they had that checkpoint, but you didn't have to show ID. But I did have 4 pages ballot, and I would have to vote on something like the water district sewer manager. That's no joke. I was actually voting for the water districts. I do not know what the water district sewer manager does, but I still had to vote for them. Fortunately, it was easy to choose who to vote for because only one person ran. So, you know, it's sort of democracy gone wild in the US. And so, you know, again, be careful what you wish for. For those of us who want to see more voting and more elections, there's some cautionary tales for some parts of the world. But it's an excellent transition to introduce our first special guest we have with us. Sharmila Biswas-Mistry is with Elections Canada, where she leads voter outreach and education for first-time electors. And they have been amazing partners and allies for us in our work to demystify the voting process, because as we have seen, for many folks, myself included, coming and voting in Canada for the first time, I assumed it was way more complicated than it is. So a lot of our process is helping simply to demystify the voting process. So we're gonna give Sharmila just a couple of moments to introduce herself, talk a little bit about the work she's doing and the work's happening in Elections Canada before turning it over to our main guests. So Sharmila, over to you.
Thank you, John. It's always such a pleasure to participate in your events. As John said, I am with Elections Canada, and we're the independent, nonpartisan federal agency responsible for conducting federal elections in Canada. And part of Elections Canada's mandate is to be ready to run an election at all times. Now, we just don't know when that all times is going to be. We really don't have any influence and have no indication when an election is going to be called. That's the Prime Minister's who decides that. But we just need to know, we need to be ready to run it. And it's fair to assume that the election may be called during this crazy pandemic time. So the election is going to look and feel different, so be prepared. Our mission is to ensure that every Canadian exercises their democratic right to vote and to be a candidate. To vote in a federal election in Canada, you have to be at least 18 years old and a Canadian citizen. So John mentioned that I'm part of the outreach team at Elections Canada, and we run the Inspire Democracy program. This program helps to reduce the barriers that certain group of Canadians, like youth, new Canadians, and electors with disabilities and Indigenous electors face. In doing so, we get to collaborate with great organizations like John's Democratic Engagement Exchange to help us amplify our voter information. So our research shows that many new Canadians, which we defined as Canadian citizens who have been in Canada for less than 10 years, do face many barriers to exercising their right to vote in federal elections. Those barriers are an unfamiliarity with the election process, difficulty meeting identification requirements when registering and voting. New Canadians are less likely to know whether they're registered in the first place. And if they don't receive a voter information card, they assume that they just can't vote. And they're also less aware of the voting options like advance voting. So to address these barriers, Election Canada works very hard to make sure the electoral process and materials are more accessible to new Canadians. We also have 2 products that are available at the next, that will be available at the next federal election in over 30 different languages other than English and French, and these will be available on our website. During the election, we do have interpretation services that are offered at all Election Canada's offices across the country when the election is called. We have over-the-phone services that cover more than 100 languages, and interpreters are available at the polls to help electors vote when booked in advance. We also offer the Community Relations Officer Program, which is responsible to reach out to people in the community, depending on the demographics of the riding. During the 2019 election, we had over 1,500 community relations officers specifically outreaching to new Canadians. We also developed the 3 Inspire Democracy Toolkit for community leaders like yourselves to engage your membership and on how to participate in elections. Each toolkit includes a call to action, promotes learning, and supports networking opportunities. Now, speaking of active citizenship, A great way to get involved in the next federal election is to work in it. Be that friendly face at the polls when your members go and vote. To work in a federal election, you have to be at least 16 years old and a Canadian citizen. During each federal election, Elections Canada hires 280,000 election workers, and these are paid position folks. You can apply for these jobs before the election is called. All you have to do is fill out the online application in the employment section at elections.ca. Once the election is called, the recruitment will start. And if you are worried about working during the pandemic, we got you covered. Elections Canada has taken all the necessary precautions to keep you safe. We will provide you with personal protective equipment and make sure that physical distancing measures are in place. The best way to be ready for the next, to plan for the next federal election is to have a plan. There are things that you can do right now to prepare for the election, whenever it is. Before the election is called, you can go find out if you're registered, or if you need to update your address, you can visit elections.ca. And now, if you are registered, you will get a voter information card in the mail a couple of weeks after the election is called. And you can use that card as a proof of address. But you can also register when you go to vote at the polls. I know there's a lot of people out there today who may not be Canadian citizens, but still want to get involved. And while you may not be able to vote or work in the federal election, you can certainly encourage your family, friends, and communities who are citizens to do so and to share that information with them. So that's it for me for the opening act. I will include my email and some website so you can contact me directly if you have any questions, or if you want to join our network. I'd be more than happy to put you on the list, and you can get all our election information. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sharmila. And now you understand why Sharmila is so great at her job, and why Elections Canada is your authoritative source for information about where, when, and ways to vote. And so we appreciate all the work that you do to make elections accessible to all Canadians. So now I'm thrilled to welcome our two guests who are working at the front lines of practice and research. Kadeen Bankason is a community facilitator, educator, and grassroots organizer in Toronto, and has led community development and engagement initiatives with communities for 15 years. In her current role as a civic engagement and community action coordinator at North York Community House, Kadeen has worked closely with the Democracy Talks Toolkit, which we've done together, to engage diverse immigrant, newcomer, and refugee communities in mock campaigns and elections, digital stories, and community mapping. She is also working with us on a broader project with North York and Okassie and Ryerson on active citizenship, and we'll be able to speak to some of that work as well. And it's great to see Kadeen, even if virtually, although we've had much more fun when we've gotten to work together in the same room. I'm going to introduce Alina next. So what I love about Alina DeRoy's work is that she is not only determined to understand the problems that she studies, but also to develop evidence-based solutions. Alina is a professor of political science at Simon Fraser University, and correct me if I'm wrong, you're not yet a Canadian citizen? That's right, so can't vote here, but I'll ask you maybe later if you're planning on becoming a Canadian citizen. Yes. So most of Alina's work is about how we can encourage people who don't typically vote or participate in politics to do so in order to increase their voice in politics. In her research, she pays particular attention to the role of group identities and her interactions with others in fostering political engagement. And while finding time to write dozens of published papers, present at conferences around the world, and teach 2 courses, she also spends time at the front lines by working with community organizations to design field experiments to better understand the political participation by immigrants and refugees. And I think, is a great example of why we are so lucky to have so many folks joining us from around, moving to Canada from around the world and actually enriching our democracy. So I'm going to now turn it over to Alina and then Kadeen, who will be making brief presentations before we jump into, we held a broader conversation amongst the three of us and open it up to everyone for questions. Okay, over to you, Alina.
Thank you, John. I'm just going to share my screen. Please let me know if people can't see this.
Working? Yep.
Yeah, okay.
Great.
Before we start, I just want to acknowledge, as I'm based on the West Coast, that I'm actually have the privilege to work and live on the unceded traditional Coast Salish lands, which include, of course, the Squamish, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Musqueam nations. And the work I'm presenting today here is really driven by the question of how do immigrants, so those people who've moved countries, like myself, come to feel part of, engage in a new political community. And that broadly defined. So I don't just look at voting, I also look at other types of political involvement. Now, in this brief talk, I want to highlight two key debates in the academic literature and talk about what I also see as two key enabling factors that encourage active citizenship. Now, the first debate is about how and when we form attitudes about politics and the political system and how we adopt certain participatory behaviors. And so whether that is voting, protesting, or demonstrating, or engaging in local community action. So on the one hand, there's the idea that political attitudes and behaviors are really formed very early in life, or at least up until the kind of the pre-adults, maybe even mid-20s. And that if individuals migrate after these formative years, that there will be very little adaptation to their new society. On the other hand, there's the idea that immigrants are essentially a blank slate upon arrival, and that they adapt their attitudes and behaviors purely in response to the political experiences in the new country. Now, White and colleagues have called these ideas resistance and exposure, but also suggest a probably more realistic third option, namely the idea of transferability, which suggests that immigrants build on their pre-existing beliefs and habits in responding to political experiences in the new country. Now, this is not just a purely academic debate. I know we're sometimes a bit obscure, but it actually touches on some important debates about the adaptability of new arrivals, of limits of potential policies in receiving societies, and of the role that positive experiences that migrants might bring with them play in the politics of their new country. Now, the few studies that have actually looked at these kind of trade-offs show some mixed results, and some show more support for the importance of pre-migration experiences, whereas others stress the importance of adaptation. Now, I have looked at this in quite a wide view, looking at very many countries. So I'll talk you through it, don't get too lost in the details here, because what I did is I looked at a broad section of countries, 31 receiving countries in total, and more than 100 countries of origin. And I had a look at whether we can see any patterns. So this is quite broad research, and the data comes from the European Social Survey, but sadly it doesn't include Canada, but we can still learn some stuff of this. So for instance, when we look at direct political action, as I did here, and that's asking people whether they have signed a petition, whether they've demonstrated, or whether they boycotted. And if we then focus on destination countries, so the countries people have moved to, we see wide varieties. So we see, for instance, that 60% of all immigrants in Iceland indicates to have participated in a form of direct political action in the last year, as opposed to only about 5% in Greece, for instance. Now, likewise, if we look at where people come from, and this is a snapshot because there's more countries in my data than this, but if we just look at immigrants based on where they come from across the whole data set, we also see a lot of variation. So we, for instance, see that immigrants who migrate from Germany, France, and Sweden tend to participate at very high rates, whereas immigrants who originated from, say, Brazil and Albania participate at much lower rates. Now, what I don't show here is that there are also within country quite a lot of variation depending on which country of origin people come from. Now, to kind of get a handle on this, and again, I'll talk you through this, I ran a series of statistical models predicting whether an individual immigrant has either participated or not in the form or in terms of signing petitions, demonstrating, or boycotting. And I included both factors that relate to immigrants themselves, specific individual factors, as well as factors that relate to the context, the country they came from, as well as the country they migrated to. And so there's a few takeaways I want to just focus on here, and we can talk, of course, more later if you want to. First, across the board, individual differences in what one might call resources clearly matter. So for instance, those which speak the language of the country they move to, those who have a higher level of education, those with higher levels of employment are more likely to participate politically. Whether you're interested in politics, that's that idea of transferability potentially, matters a great deal. So these are things we know matter for everyone, not just new citizens. And then also, for instance, what does matter, also not surprisingly, is whether you're a citizen or not. So my data included citizens as well as non-citizens, but citizens are more likely to engage in political action. Now, another finding here at the bottom is that the longer an individual has lived in a country, the more likely they are to participate. Again, maybe not a surprise, but it does tell us that there is a certain line of expectation in terms of time, and that people might have different priorities when they first come to a country in terms of finding a job, finding housing, building community. And finally, we see that individuals are more likely to participate in a form of direct political action if the overall rate of direct political action in their country of origin is higher. So if you're coming from a country which has high direct forms of political participation, you're more likely to participate at a high rate in the country you move to. Similarly, if in the country that you've moved to, there's high rates of direct political action, you're also more likely to participate at a higher rate. And this really kind of signals the importance of. So to sum up, although your own resources certainly matter, and where you lived before migrating is also not unimportant, there is evidence that migrants adapt substantially to their new political context. If participation rates are high, they're much more likely to also engage than when participation rates are low. And they're much more likely to do so the longer they live in their new country. Now, the second important academic debate I wanted to highlight today is whether we first need people to get engaged, that is, interested and knowledgeable about Canada in general and Canadian politics specifically, before they are really willing to get politically active. Because often there's this assumption that political engagement, so things like interest, trust, knowledge, precedes or maybe should precede participation or even formal inclusion, i.e. the right to vote. But increasingly, there's research that suggests that participation might actually lead to engagement. So, and more further participation and a stronger identification with the new country. So it's a little bit of a chicken and egg question, but it is important, for instance, when it comes to discussions about something I care a lot about, the extending voting rights to migrants that have permanent residency status in local election. The idea that maybe if they have the right to vote, it actually might increase their psychological engagement, their political engagement. Now, on this, I did a very small pilot study. Spoiler alert, it wasn't very successful. But the idea was to take advantage of the extension of voting rights for the first time to non-citizens in San Francisco in school board elections. This was the very first election in the United States in 2018, where documented non-citizens were allowed to vote. And we designed a study, me and my colleagues, to test whether first-time voters, compared to a control group, felt a greater sense of belonging and an increased interest in politics, among other things, after they had voted. Now, sadly, the study was a big flop, and that was in part because citywide, a whole number of 49 non-citizens registered to vote in the whole of the election. But that had more to do, as we found out through informal conversations, with the US political climate at the time, and I'm happy to talk more about that. But these sorts of studies can kind of help us answer these questions. Now, then to my two enabling factors, and I'll go through this fairly quickly, things I want to highlight, and things Sharmila also highlighted, so I know that people working in this field definitely have had this experience, but just to highlight again. So one thing is that we do know that habit formation matters. That is, voting leads to more voting. Participation leads to more participation. One type of form of participation, signing petitions, potentially leads to, say, protesting. And so there's relation, getting people, so getting that foot in the door is really important. We know this generally for people, specifically with migrants and with immigrants. We know that there's some preliminary evidence of early access to voting, increasing the likelihood to vote in future elections, and some very tentative suggested evidence that it does also then impact engagement more generally. So the second enabling factor I want to highlight, which is maybe even more important and comes from my own work broadly on participation, is the role of social connection, or connections with other people. So we know that being asked to vote or being asked to participate is a really big explanation for why people do so. Simply having somebody say, hey, why don't you? But it turns out that the best people to do the asking are actually close friends and families. And I've argued in previous work that this is because of three reasons. One, information that comes from friends and family. We listen to that more carefully. We take that on board more easily than information saved through leaflets. It's also due to expectations. Our friends and family can exert sometimes subtle but social pressures. One really should vote, or why don't you come out? This is an important issue to have your voice heard on. And finally, that sense of belonging. Participating together, doing something together gives us as humans that sense of belonging, and doing with the groups that you have a connection with enhances the opportunities and the chances that you will get out and do something, whether that's voting or demonstrating. Okay, thank you. That were my point for discussions, and I really look forward to what Kadeen has to say.
Thank you very much. All right, and we'll just jump right over to Kadeen. You're muted there.
Yes, of course. That's our catchphrase for quarantine, or our time working virtually and remotely, is you are muted. Okay. Hold on. Of course, my screen share isn't going to work right now. Hi, everyone. I'm very happy to be here, and thank you so much to John and the Democracy Dialogues for having me here today. So I really appreciate hearing from Eileen's presentation as well, because it just adds, the research and the data to the experience that I've had on the ground, for many years doing community development work in the city of Toronto, but even more recently, really kind of honing and focusing that into kind of the civic engagement, right? How we are actually participating in civic processes and really supporting residents in their communities, newcomers, refugees, long-term, even long-standing immigrants in the country, to really become engaged and participate in all types of democratic processes. So I kind of thought democracy in action is one way to think about this work. But I really want to highlight how the way, or at least the ways in which we kind of start this work of engaging communities, right? Taking people who are living or having experiences in any local area, and really first starting with this idea of how do we inform? How do we create awareness? How do we ensure that people just have some knowledge around what's happening around them, and moving them into the space where that knowledge and awareness then is an encouraging or a motivating factor to actually participate, to actually make decisions, and to be encouraged to take their engagement or their actions even farther, and really become engaged in whether it's political processes or not, but really engaged in decisions that have an impact or a direct impact on their life, their health, and their well-being, not only for themselves, but for their families and for their entire communities, right? So community engagement, as it increases, or as we really commit to even building awareness in individuals, or encouraging participation, then we really are moving them into the space where they have enough confidence, skills, and information to be able to take active roles. We move then from kind of engagement only into, you know, the idea of civic engagement. Well, if people are kind of participating in very local initiatives, you know, or localized initiatives that impact them directly and impact their communities, right, then what is the relationship then to going to the next step of, you know, actually making a difference in the civic life of communities, or really applying knowledge, skills, you know, their values, their motivation to being able to make that difference, right? So now even taking just awareness and participation, even attendance, if you will, showing up to the level of engaging others and or supporting political representation and or encouraging voting in communities. So we're really then kind of moving from just community engagement and into civic engagement by saying we want to promote quality of life through both political and non-political processes. And my work in community, I can say quite honestly, beginning as, or starting my relationship to kind of community development and eventually into what I've called community-based politics, is this, you know, has really been the relationship to saying, all right, in order for me to make change or to encourage other residents to be involved in processes that will make change in their communities, right? We really were not able to do that effectively without engaging in political processes, whether that meant having just building relationships with the political representatives, you know, who serve our communities and our neighborhoods, to actually encouraging voting, to even not only encouraging voting, but encouraging informed, aware voting with those who are able to. Oops. My slide disappeared. I went black screen for a moment. Of course, there's no end to the exciting things that happen with Zoom. But my next slide was actually going to introduce the Democracy Talks toolkit, as well as the Vote pop-up kit, and speak a little bit to the ways in which I've been able to use these tools. I've been able to use these tools in my work at North York Community House, or in my role as a, you know, a community action and civic engagement coordinator, to support residents kind of furthering their ability to be actively engaged. And we've used this work, I've used these toolkits with newcomers who are learning to speak English in linked classes. And we're talking newcomers who are, you know, at level 1, 2, and 3, so very early in their English skills. We've used it with youth who are also immigrants, refugees, newcomers in high schools. We've also used these tools with seniors, you know, women who are organizing in their communities who are also non-English speaking, to really introduce, you know, conversations around what matters to you. Let's also participate in mock elections. So if we were to use the what matters to you as the Plato's Republic, our Plato's Republic activity that's taken directly out of the Democracy Talks toolkit. Right, we are using this as a way to encourage participation in a safe, kind of non-partisan or not really politically focused way, and encourage people to really start to be critical about what's important to you, what matters to you, what in fact are the issues that are really directly connected to your lived experiences getting settled in Canada. Where are opportunities for you to really think about the issues that are impacting your community as a whole, and then being critical about what steps and actions you might need to take or see to be able to address or to improve or to even have a voice or an opinion on those matters. The Vote pop-up toolkit, or the Vote pop-up kit, is actually fantastic in helping to demystify the act of voting. What does it mean to get a ballot and vote anonymously? What does it mean to have only one choice or one selection and having to make a decision on your first choice or your only choice or your top choice, if you will? And I noticed that these activities used in various programs, whether with high school students or English learners, with seniors, really allowed and encouraged, questions, dialogue. I don't understand. Let's really think about why this is important. Why is voting a privilege? What are the reasons, or the reasons that voting then is integral to how you're able to take action and to make changes in your community, right? So really having to start with what's very local and relevant and direct and immediate to an individual, to anybody's lives, to then using activities that are fun, that are interactive, and in many ways safe, taking away the kind of the tension, if you will, around talking or dealing with politics, and really moving those into opportunities for dialogue and action, right? If I can understand how voting works and understand the processes and the supports that enable me to do that, I'm more willing to then take the step to actually get myself registered. Of course, being able to, noting that I had to meet the criteria first. I want to conclude, because I know time is also short, by quickly introducing and making some reference to the Active Citizenship Project. What is up with?
It was working. It was almost there.
Okay. All right. So Active Citizenship Project, that is a 5-year project that is currently has just completed its first year of development. That is a partnership between North York Community House, the Democratic Engagement Exchange, and OCASI to really build out a curriculum, if you will, a new set of tools and to support, settlement work, but also to support the engagement and the integration of newcomers and immigrants into our political systems, right? Building familiarity, building a relationship to our democracy here through the development of tools and curriculum. And in 5 years, you can see that there are a lot of goals that they will accomplish. In year 1, there has been an opportunity to connect with service providers and newcomers in the city to get their experiences, their insights, to be able to inform, at least in this first phase, what this curriculum could and should involve. And the goal is really to be able to give this curriculum to the settlement sector as another set of materials and resources to support this work across the country. I might stop here. I know that I'm missing some really important points around the Active Citizenship Project, but really to highlight that, the goal of in addition to creating this curriculum, is meant to do it in partnership with, so alongside, let's, really incorporate co-design as a value in how these materials are developed, right? And it is also meant to be developed alongside, those that will use the tools, so that really it reflects not only the experiences of newcomers coming into Canada, but also to really represent the needs and what the priorities are of those workers and staff who are delivering, and also building and establishing those relationships to ensure that folks get settled into Canada well. And I think I'll stop there for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kadeen. That was great. There's both presentations, lots to unpack. As always, we sort of run out of time, but I want to encourage folks to ask questions in the chat. I will ask an opening question here, but I really want to allow as much time as possible for participants, everybody who's showed up here today to ask questions. So please queue those up in the chat function, and Ashley will be sort of helping to navigate those, and we'll be asking those in a second. But I wanted to start by digging into something that I think you both mentioned, which I think is really at the heart of the work that we're all involved in. It's the idea of building a culture of democratic engagement and political engagement. And I think this is both there's some exciting opportunities and then challenges associated with doing that. And I think, Alina, you know, this idea, which I really love the framing of the chicken and egg, whether it takes sort of a psychological engagement precedes participation, or if you can participate and build it. And I mean, I suspect there are both chickens and eggs involved in this process. But if you can maybe speak to some of your, field research and how you've seen that question play out, or how you see that play out, in the research that you've seen. And Kadeen, if you could also speak to that question, because we see it in the Democracy Talks area for sure, is that, people who really don't talk about politics, given a chance to talk about things that interest them, and then that encouraging them to go deeper, and sort of how that functions. So maybe start with Alina there.
Yeah, so I notice the evidence I know most strongly for it is in the kind of turnout literature, voting turnout, where we do know if you get people to the ballot box, and through randomized trials, for instance, there's been tests, in particular groups that don't normally vote. So in the US, there's been a lot of work on, for instance, populations, migrant populations, but also I know a study on prisoners who really have very low voter rates, ex-prisoners. And just reaching out to people and getting them to the polls that first time seems to have huge knock-on effects. And so getting that foot in the door, particularly with voting, but in my own work, the other thing I've shown is how people are not active in one way. If people are active, they're active in multiple ways. So if you get them to, to first a low-key thing like a signing petition, it's easier to then get them to maybe protest, and so all these activities, or to do something in the community. And so I think it is definitely a chicken and egg thing that goes both ways. But I think if you can start with some low-level ways of getting people involved, you kind of get that ball moving. I'll stop there to leave enough.
Yeah.
No, I think it's a great question, because what I encounter in the community very often is, or at least, this first barrier that we have to get beyond is the idea of trust, right? Trust in the system, trust that what's going to happen or the decisions or who's elected is going to actually reflect the needs of what we have in community. Like there's so many ways that people have to feel confident in how the institutions work, right? It's interesting though, at a community level, that we can really start to build trust by making and actually having small successes in the community. Like if we know that we've been locked out of an experience we've had so many times, we've been locked out of community spaces, but those community spaces facilitate meetings, facilitate programs, facilitate social connections. And then we go out and we're like, okay, what do we need to do? We want to get into our spaces. We're not able to have access for whatever reasons. Once we are able to accomplish that, we might coordinate some meetings, have the conversations we need with the decision makers, and then have that success, right? Suddenly people are encouraged and say, oh, okay, in fact, showing up, attending the meeting, signing that letter made a difference. Something worked there. you know what, I'm going to continue to participate. I'll come back to the next meeting. In fact, you know what, I'd like to be a part of the committee that is going to plan our all candidates meeting, and I'm going to show up to the all candidates meeting. And suddenly we'll see that really, if we're able to be successful with kind of these small actions at a local level, we encourage and are really encouraging people to continue to be involved. All right, something in this process works. Something, in fact, in how we approach this has led us to a success. So I definitely think that there are ways that, you know, just participating or just showing up can really, you know, be a step that leads us into further engagement.
So the first question we have from our audience comes from John R. And asking if the speakers can address the experience of immigrant seniors with regard to political and civic participation, and are there differences compared to the situation from non-immigrant seniors? And maybe, Alina, this may get at some of the points that you were raising about socialization and whether there's adaptation versus socialization. So I don't know if you've seen any of that in your research, and then maybe we can turn over to Kadeen and talk about her experience.
I'll be brief because I haven't looked at seniors specifically, and I suspect Kadeen has more to say on this. I think there's certainly more barriers for seniors who have migrated, especially if they migrated recently, more often in terms of language skills, in terms of getting knowledge or, you know, as we talked about, kind of technical literature. So I think there's probably more barriers, even more than among non-immigrant seniors. But other than that, I'm going to go to Kadeen because I think she has more to say on this.
Yeah, difficult. I think it's a little bit difficult for me to be able to contrast, you know, or really speak to the contrast or the comparison that in the question. And I answer from a very, you know, kind of anecdotal way as well. I love seniors. I love working with seniors in this capacity because they have a history, they have experiences that are so profound in the way that they can really encourage. Hey, you know what? I've lived in this community for 50 years and we didn't have this bus here, you know, that now people are take advantage of. And we did all of these actions and activities, you know, and meetings with the counselor to get this bus route here. I can remember that story, you know, being one of the stories I'd heard shared in the community. But they have time, you know, as well. They have time in many ways that, you know, working, the parents don't, and even the students don't these days. And I have found that in many ways, because of their time and their experiences in history, whether they have been in Canada for a long time or new to Canada and have a relationship to, you know, to their home countries, that what they can really do is encourage. You know, they can really encourage people to stay committed. This is what we need to do. You know, I've got a view, I've got a perspective that is, you know, that's one that is profound in the way we can support engagement in our communities. I did do some democracy talks work with a group of South Asian women. There was about 30 of them actually who'd been in Canada for all different periods of times. And English, you know, there were a few who were able to translate, you know, or do the translations for the majority of the group who weren't English speakers. But they all had relationships with their MPP. They all knew her by first name. She'd come to the meetings on so many times and they're like, yes, no, we know her and we like her, and, you know, we vote and we support her, right? And so in that aspect of it, they're very able to be, you know, very, in many ways, politically inclined because they have the experience and understand what it means to have the opportunity to vote and what, you know, putting your voice forward actually means and the impacts that it can have. So I really enjoy the time with the seniors or the elders in the community because they really do a lot to anchor and encourage political participation.
Yeah, I mean, and I would just jump in, sharing Kadeen's joy of working with older folks in our community, and because, and it was actually with North York, sitting in their old offices in their tiny conference room there with a bunch of volunteers. And we do an activity where we ask everybody their favorite, who they would choose as leader of Canada if they could choose anyone in the world. And we'd gone around the room, and the last person to speak was a volunteer with North York, who was an older person who had grown up in China. And he said, well, I grew up in a country that didn't have a strong democracy, that didn't, that had strong leaders, very strong leaders that actually did bad things. So he said, I'm not going to choose a leader. I'm going to choose a system, and I'm going to choose democracy. And I think that's one of the unique things that not just seniors, but certainly seniors as well, of new Canadians can bring is the wisdom of their experience from their countries of origin. And we can find a way to listen for that wisdom. We will all benefit. So I think we often frame this conversation as what are the benefits that we're giving to people who are new to Canada in terms of understanding Canada's democracy. But I think there are significant benefits that we need to remember that people who are new to Canada bring to our democracy if we're smart enough and wise enough to listen to those and to curate conversations where that can happen. Because there will be disconnects and there will be things that they don't know. I still don't really understand, how the Liberal Party in BC relates to the Liberal National Party. But, it's like we have a unique system here. But I think that that's part of what may happen here. Okay, I wanted to jump now into a couple more questions that have come in from Sarah. Coming from a child and youth care background, how can we incorporate active citizenship into less formal and day-to-day activities for young people, especially when elections may not be happening? And maybe that's a good question for Kadeen. I know you and I know North York Community House does a lot around this. I know that they've done some democracy talks with some of the little folks there too.
Thank you. That's a great question. So I recommend taking a look at the toolkit, right? And just getting familiar with some of what's in there, because there are some great activities there are the longer sessions that are, meant to really help us kind of dig into one approach or really explore power, for instance, as one of the activities. And then there are these really short activities like Stand Where You Stand, for instance, that I love to use. That is very much a kind of a visual. We move around the room on a spectrum of what strongly agree and strongly disagree. We ask questions we ask questions, and I was trying to pull one from my mind at that moment. And we say, hey, okay, place yourself on the spectrum, stand where you stand in relation to this question of, should immigrants be allowed to vote, right? Or have the right to vote, let's say in Canada. Do you strongly agree or strongly disagree? And you kind of place yourself anywhere along the spectrum. But what that does is encourage the sharing of opinions and ideas and thoughts in a very structured way. Let's have this conversation that could be very controversial in some spaces, but in this space, that's our program space. It's safe. We're here to have conversations and deal with the issues. We're going to have this particular conversation in this way, right? And whether you choose to actually say, that yes, I agree, or I strongly agree, or no, I disagree, you can make a statement by simply standing where you stand, because you really are positioning yourself as representing your opinion, right? So I kind of use that as an example to say that with the young people as well, what we often are trying to encourage them to recognize is that their opinions, their ideas, their experiences matter, right? They are reflective of what our lives are like in this country. So, it's a combination of everybody's experiences. So being able to encourage their participation, in conversations, that really get them thinking critically about issues. Even when it's not election time, that means that they've been armed in some ways or prepared, to be able to think about platforms or experience or reflect on their candidates from a space that's got a bit more information, that may have some insights and some critical thinking there as well, right? So there's all kinds of ways that we can get young people thinking about what their experiences are, their daily experiences, what they may need or want, as a way to encourage, real kind of active participation when political processes are in front of them.
Yeah, and I think that's great. And I think with the stand activity, you can also mix it up and throw in sort of fun questions as well. Important questions like whether snow is a good thing or not, but that idea of how do we have discourse around things we disagree on. So I'm gonna aware of time. We have two more questions that have come in that are somewhat related, so I'm going to try to combine them for quick response. So the first question is, how can we engage newcomers to be influencers in their countries of origins to improve democracy? And the second question is kind of the flip side of this, is about how do we outreach to for people who have come from oppressive regimes? And if there is a distinction there, now, big topics, but I think that question of, what is our responsibility back to the countries of origin for people who are living in Canada, and how does that, especially from oppressive regimes, impact their experience here? And I don't know, Alina, maybe I'll give you a first shot. If you've seen anything in any of your data that speaks to the distinction there, based on the nature of the regime from country of origin.
Yes, well, so we definitely do see that people who come from places where there's low participation rates, which often go hand in hand with repressive types of regimes, tend to have lower participation rates when they move to another country to start with. Time can rectify these things, like being just in a country for a while. And I think the other thing in terms of encouraging them participation back home, again, to my point that participation breeds participation. And I think politics is one thing, and sometimes we think about in home country or here, but often you see people getting, for instance, with the Indian farmers protests, we're very active in BC, trying to make people aware here about what's happening back home. So I think just getting people, even in Canadian politics, active will enable them to also be more active at home. And then a final point, of course, you hope that there's enough protection for people if they do speak out. And if they legal protections and government protections here.
Okay, well, part of my job here is to be timekeeper, and I'm aware that it is now 2:29. So I do want to ask one last fun question, because we are all in this crazy time of and challenging time of the pandemic. So I want to ask both Kadeen and Alina to share their favorite recommendations, or three things they would recommend for us to watch as we have our time in whatever time we have to watch things. I'm always looking for new good recommendations. So Kadeen, maybe let's start with you. What your three recommendations of things you've enjoyed watching or we should be watching?
Can you believe that that's the hardest question you've asked in the last hour, John? Okay, so I've got on my list right now, and it's a new kind of mini series, but it's really focused on it's called Exterminate the Brutes by Raoul Peck. It's a new one that's just started airing on HBO, and it is really connected to systems of white supremacy and anti-Black racism, and the kind of the historical development of that as well. So I've only gotten through one episode. That's a bit heavy, honestly, but I'm like, it's on my checklist there. For all the old sentimental folks who have any relationship to Coming to America, the part 2 just came out at the beginning of this year. So that's been a nice, just a fun one that I've enjoyed watching with my family and my kids, and saying like, hey, this is, from part 2 of something that was really important to a lot of people back then. And Zamunda before there was Wakanda. So yeah, absolutely. And lastly, I would say Yeah, I've been kind of going backwards through some of the old Avengers and Marvel flicks with my family. So we've been doing a lot of superheroes in the last little while as well. So not too deep, but lots of fun. Absolutely.
Wonderful selection. Thank you. Lena, over to you.
I really enjoyed the political drama Borgen, a Danish political science is really cool to watch. I also like crime shows, particularly European ones. So there's a show called Criminal UK and Criminal France, Criminal Spain, Criminal Germany, which I really enjoyed watching. And then in terms of lighthearted shows, one that I liked was Blown Away, a glassblower competition, which is, I learned a lot about glassblowing, so I'd highly recommend that.
Oh, that's great. Great. Well, those are almost all new to me. Although Borgen, I also have, yes, I've already binged. So, but that's, yes, I'm such a political nerd. And so with that, I think we've kept almost to time. But again, want to thank both Kadeen and Alina and Sharmila for joining us today. You know, lots more to unpack here. Certainly, we will be sharing these resources online and encourage you to stay connected. As Sharmila said, while elections kind of has nothing to do with the election date, there could be an election this year. We over at the Democratic Engagement Exchange are preparing as if there will be an election this fall. So please stay in touch, follow us on social media. We will be releasing a bunch of election readiness tools and materials. And so we can help build a culture of engagement. And I think one thing we can all agree that the best way to strengthen democracy is to invite your friends and family to go vote, take them to go vote. That's the one thing I think all political scientists would agree is that if we want to strengthen our democracy, it works best through relationships. And even if they say, well, I don't really know how to vote for, it's like, well, you know, we could talk about it on the way as we walk on over, or go online and fill in our request for mail-in ballots. But thank you all so much. And we stay tuned. We'll be announcing more democracy dialogues in the series soon. And I hope everyone stays well and healthy and adds to their watching list now. All right, take care.